Hi everyone, and welcome to the first lesson of this year for my OCAD Studio course. We're going to be kind of going back to basics a bit and looking at basic types of line for this lesson, or basic line drawing. So it's a pretty fundamental thing, quite foundational for all sort of forms of drawing and painting. It's good to kind of refresh yourself a bit regardless of your level. Pretty much anyone benefits from focusing on these sorts of concepts and trying to implement them in any work that you do, so regardless of the complexity of what you're doing. It's definitely worthwhile always considering the importance of line, how primary line is for anything that you're doing. So to begin with, I'm just going to talk about straight lines. Which probably seems like the most simple form of basic lines imaginable. Straight lines are very useful if you're working from life. They're useful so that you can figure out exactly, measure and then copy the distance between points. So if you're creating constructs from life, straight lines tend to be the way to go. They're very accurate. They're less prone to being as distorted as curved lines can be. So if you're sort of deconstructing the width of a head or the proportions within a head or something like that, I recommend connecting things with straight lines, creating your articulations with straight lines. Just because you can be a lot more specific with distances between points, with angles between points. If you start to introduce curves, then it becomes more difficult to kind of judge angles when you're looking at something and looking at your drawing in comparison. So straight lines are most useful for representational drawing. I'll be talking about how you can implement curved lines in representational drawing a little bit later, so you can use a combination of straight lines and curved lines, beginning with, say, a gesture, which I'll talk about, and then turning into construct. You wouldn't typically use straight lines to capture the mood or the sort of flow of a subject, because typically things are more dynamic than a straight line is capable of capturing. Obviously there are exceptions to that rule, but generally you'll need some sort of curve within a composition to capture the flow of it. Following on from that, the main thing about straight lines, sort of in a more generally aesthetic sense or an abstract sense, is their feel tends to be more man-made. It's more geometric, architectural, so it doesn't necessarily quite have the fluidity, the natural quality that curved lines will typically have. So imagine Cubist drawings. They're much more sort of artificial looking than traditional representational drawings that use a combination of curves and straight lines. And there's many sort of successful abstract approaches to abstract art which rely more on curved lines than straight lines, and they'll also tend to feel more natural than something that as geometric as something using exclusively straight lines. So if you're going for something quite architectural in terms of feeling and mood, or you want to feel quite scientific, or kind of emphasizing the man-made nature of it, then certainly straight lines are an effective form of composition. But generally you'll need either curved lines or a mixture of curved and straight lines in order to effectively capture the flow of a subject. A little side note just about technique. When you're drawing straight lines, I recommend practicing drawing straight lines with your arm rather than with your wrist. A lot of people, when they first start drawing straight lines, focus a lot on the wrist, and they try to keep their wrist straight and tilt it as they try to draw straight lines, and you end up with kind of quite unconfident, wobbly looking straight lines. Whereas if you can use your elbow as a pivot point, or even your whole arm, you can draw very, very straight and very long lines which will feel more confident on the page. So if you're working, say, larger in a live drawing class or something like that, and you want to be able to capture draw a straight line really quickly, or connect 2 points with a straight line. You need to practice using your whole arm rather than just your wrist. It'll give more confidence to your work. The same applies to curved lines. You can exaggerate it when you do a curved line. You will find that if you were to just pivot from your wrist, you'll get a slight curve anyway. So something you'll need to practice is kind of adjusting for that as you draw your straight lines. You don't even necessarily have to draw your line immediately, so something I do is kind of ghosting over the page as you practice. Say you had a point here and a point here, and you want to connect the two of them. You can sort of practice where you want to put the line before you actually put the stroke down. So that's a useful kind of little trick to use when you're drawing. You can sort of basically you just see the line before you actually draw it. So I can see as my pencil goes up how straight or how curved that line seems to be. Your eye kind of sees the pencil move, and then you just replicate that however you want to. So that's pretty much how you use straight lines. We'll come back a little bit to straight lines once we're talking about once we've talked about curved lines, how you use them together to create a composition. But now we're just going to move into SCurves and SCurves, which are two basic forms of curved lines. So a SCurve is, as you'd imagine, something which roughly follows the shape of a C. So a SCurve can come in kind of any level of extreme tension. It can be just a shallow SCurve, or it can get kind of gradually more extreme. Now something that really makes curved lines differ from straight lines is something I would call energy, or sort of potential energy that a line can contain. If you look at a straight line compared to a curved line, the straight line feels a lot less dynamic than the curved line, partly because there's more obvious movement in the curved line, in that it is itself constantly changing and shifting, whereas the straight line is static. But also there's this sense that all lines want to become straight lines. Something about the way that we sort of are aware of things having tension and then releasing them in terms of energy. So if you look at a tree bending in the wind, or you kind of pull a string on a bow or something like that, you feel like at some point it's going to go back to the place it began. So this curved line holds energy that you feel like wants to snap back into a straight line. And the straight line obviously isn't going to go anywhere, it's just a straight line. So you can imbue a composition or a subject with a sense of dynamism just by creating coiled energy within it using line. And a lot of classical paintings will use this to great effect. An easy example is Rubens' figure paintings. If you look at his multifigural paintings, each figure, most of the figures have some kind of dynamic curved energy built into them, and they all flow against each other, and it imbues the whole painting with this very extreme sense of movement. In no way does it feel wooden, it feels like everything's kind of about to move or is moving, and it can create a very dynamic composition. Likewise, you get a lot of successful abstract painting which relies on these very basic kind of pretty much abstract principles of how we relate to visual forms. So they will use kind of relationships between straight lines and circles and curves and squiggles in order to kind of create something of a story or something almost musical, something building tension and releasing tension. It's a very abstract way of thinking about line, but it's generally something that underlies figurative as well as abstract art. So when you see a figure painted by a really good painter, usually there'll be more to that than just looking at that person and painting them. They will have constructed some kind of underlying composition that the subject adheres to, or they'll have manipulated nature as they saw it to conform to whatever they wanted it to be. So they can exaggerate the gesture, which is the sort of the general feel or sweep of a subject, in order to make it seem even more energetic or less energetic than it was in relation to another subject. Which is what art's all about. So obviously in abstract art, but also in figurative art, you're not just copying what's there like a camera does, you're interpreting what's there and turning it into something that's more contrived, generally more contrived, even if you were just doing a kind of a gestural response to a subject very quickly. You're still kind of modulating what you see and conforming it to whatever you want it to be as the artist. And that's the interesting thing about visual art, even at this most basic level. So the second type of curved line I'm going to talk about, which rounds out these three basic lines that we're looking at, is an S-curve. So you see S-curves quite a lot in art as well. They also contain energy, but they contain a different sort of energy to a C-curve. So S-curves feel more like a spring. So you feel like this S-curve would eventually spring out into a straight line, rather than going this way or going that way, because it already opposes itself. So there's an equal amount of energy here as there is here. So all they can do is work against each other and straighten out that way, which is different to a C-curve, which has a kind of an obvious kind of bias one way or the other in terms of its energy. So C-curves actually occur a lot in natural forms of humans and animals. Opposing, it's to do with balance, I think. So generally, if something bends one way in a creature, something else will have to bend another way to compensate and create balance. Otherwise, everything would be kind of falling over itself if it was all made of straight lines or C-curves. So it is something you typically see in human forms, the S-curve. But you also see it in nature, so you can see it sometimes in trees, the way trees grow. You see C-curves as well, and straight lines, obviously. So it's just being aware of these very fundamental aspects of basic compositional line drawing, and being able to then implement them when you first start a drawing. And the main kind of skill that I want you guys to try to develop from these concepts is the ability to distill the feeling or the overall mood of a subject with line as your kind of foundational aspect. So these lines become your composition, even if they don't appear obviously in the final piece, they'll underlie it, and that's what a composition is essentially. So it's a very kind of basic introduction to composition. So as an example of this, I have printed out a drawing of a horse by Da Vinci, which very effectively demonstrates how you can capture a fairly complex subject with a pretty simple set of shapes. So I've made this printout a bit fainter than the original drawing, just so I can work over the top of it. And I'll go back into this, but it's quite a good exercise for anyone who wants to kind of play around with line to do this sort of thing, but I'll get into that later. But essentially what I'm going to do is just demonstrate what the basic forms and lines that make up this horse are, and show how we can very quickly capture the horse just with a simple set of lines. So if I begin with the horse's rear, you see there's actually pretty much just a full circle back here, which sounds more like a shape than a line. But the bit that we kind of engage with most is this back end of the circle, which becomes, I'm just trying to emphasize this a bit, which becomes a C-curve at the back of the drawing. But as I say, if you were to carry it to its kind of completion, it actually forms pretty much a perfect circle. Equally, there's another circle in the front of the horse, which probably makes an almost identically sized circle here. So you can already see that underneath this pretty realistic drawing of a horse, there are some very contrived shapes. So this isn't naturalistic, this is a manipulation of nature to try to reaffirm geometric, a kind of geometric aspect to the horse, which was very typically Renaissance. Artistically, the Renaissance was very interested in kind of underlying mathematical patterns below nature, rather than just obsessing over pure naturalism as other forms of art developed over following centuries, leading into the 19th century, where representationalism became kind of primary. You see a lot more quite obvious geometric compositions in Renaissance art. So even this simple drawing sketch of a horse, which was probably intended for a larger painting, you see these geometric forms being woven into the composition. So we've got two circles, which, if we simplify, just become two SCurves. We've then got an SCurve that forms over the back of the horse's head, neck, and into its shoulders. So you can see over here, if I just kind of keep going over and over, and that SCurve connects directly to that circle. And then down the front of the face, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, but I would say a straight line to a very subtle curve is evident. So that's 4 lines we've got. So 2 SCurves, if I really darken them for effect. 1 SCurve there, another SCurve here, SCurve there, and a straight line. So just with 4 lines, you already see the form of the horse start to emerge. So if I was to copy it over here and do a circle, then a smaller circle, then an S, and a straight line, and I only draw in these SCurves I was talking about. So you can already see the kind of a sense of movement in a horse is starting to emerge, even without any detail beyond that. If I was to block in more of the horse's snout, and perhaps a SCurve down to here, you start to see the horse emerging quite quickly. But you can see how few lines we've used to do that. It's something actually, if you look at Picasso's drawings of bulls, he really simplifies a bull down into its most basic core elements. He takes this sort of thing a lot further, but it is interesting to see in Da Vinci, once you actually start to look at the geometry within the horse, it's very contrived, it's very man-made what he's doing. It's not really a horse that we're looking at. Horses are actually really different, but this symbol of a horse becomes probably more effective than if you just drew a horse naturally as it was. The sense of power is much greater because there's a lot more energy in these curves and the relationship between them. There's this nice contrast between these extreme curves and these straight lines, which makes for a very powerful drawing. If it was carried into a painting, if he adhered to this rough drawing that he's created, it would certainly still be evident in the painting. So, as an exercise, just to finish up, that covers, in terms of concept, what I wanted to talk about. So we've covered what straight lines are, what curves are, 2 different types of curves. Theoretically, it's a pretty simple set of ideas. What a straight line does, what the 2 curves do. And as I say, you can start to mess around yourself with looking at your favourite art, whether it's abstract or representational, and doing this sort of thing with it, so you can print it out in a kind of a faded version of it, something that's desaturated and has very little contrast, and just work over the top, either with tracing paper or just directly on the paper. and play around with different types of breaking down that image. So there are different ways that I could break down the horse. I could have made this into more of a straight line. I could have made this into a straight line rather than a curve. I could make this into a straight line. And this, suddenly it starts to become a kind of more linear image, perhaps a bit less fluid than this one here. But you see, both are kind of valid in their own right, so it depends what you want to convey. If you want to give more kind of static, a more static sort of still sense of the horse, you would probably go for something that's geometric and linear. If you want something that feels like the horse is about to move, or it's got this power that's about to be released, you'd go for something maybe that uses more curves. Or you start to look at how the relationship between the straight lines and the curves works, and at what point do you have these almost rests where the eye rests because something's straight, and then it starts to flow around something, and then it goes straight again, making the front of the face more rectilinear than the body makes it seem stronger while still having that energy within the body, for instance. There's all sorts of permutations of how you can go about creating your fundamental composition for a subject. But that's what we want to look at. So if you took a figure drawing you really liked, or even a portrait of a person, or an abstract painting or drawing that you're interested in, and just try to distill it into the simplest possible set of lines, see what happens and see how you can do it differently, and you're sort of working backwards. So most artists will start at this sort of point where they think about things in a broader sense, a kind of broader compositional sense, the underlying kind of abstract composition and what that conveys, and they would turn that into something like their ultimate piece, and these things would still underlie the work. So what you're doing, if you're producing something in reverse, you're taking a finished piece and you're working back to something like this, you're starting to see the artist process as they work, and it's a really useful way to kind of get in the mind of artists that you admire, and then you can sort of do your own piece and work back the other way, and start with playing around with different lines, types of curves and straight lines, interpreting your subject in order to create something that underlies it compositionally. So this basically forms the kind of our first look at composition in its sort of simplest form. All paintings and drawings have this underlying them compositionally. So even if you had two masses next to each other, a line is formed by the fact the masses are touching. So say you had a red mass and a blue mass, and your blue mass was like this, and your red mass was like that. We see this as a line because there's a distinction between these two colours. So our eye reads this as a line. So you have to think, what does that line do when I put those two shapes next to each other? So even though they're masses of colour, they're not line, that line is still primary to what's going on. Or if they were on a white piece of paper, the outside boundary becomes a line as well. So it's important that you think about this a lot when you're working and mess around with it. As I say, this is a great exercise. I'm pretty sure it's on the OCAD studio page as an exercise as well. There is an accompanying document, which is also called Basic Line Drawing, that I think is on the blog and on the OCAD studio page, which goes into a little bit more detail about finer aspects of what I've been talking about. But hopefully this overview is interesting. And it's got a few other examples actually of me interpreting different drawings. So there's one of a figure drawing, and there's also some abstract drawings where we talk about potential compositions in abstract drawing and painting. But that pretty much covers it for today. Hopefully that was interesting. We'll be kind of following on in a few weeks with figure gesture drawing. So what we're doing in figure gesture drawing will be very similar to this. We'll be using the same lines. But we will be focusing specifically on a figure, so it'll be more applicable to life drawing classes and that sort of thing. But the human figure is a good place to mess around with different curves and straight lines and how we use them to kind of create a sense of energy. So hopefully that'll be interesting as well. But yeah, thanks for watching today, and I'll see you guys soon.